When my 23-year-old grandson Marcus looked me straight in the eye during Sunday dinner and asked Grandma Eleanor, "When do you think you'll die?" "I'm just wondering about the timeline for my inheritance." I knew something fundamental had shifted in our family. The fork in my hand trembled slightly as I sat it down next to my barely touched pot roast. For 72 years I had prided myself on reading people accurately, on understanding the hearts of those I loved most. But sitting across from this young man I had raised, supported and cherished, I realized I had been blind to a truth that was about to shatter everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, acrid and suffocating. My daughter Sarah, Marcus's mother, dropped her water glass so hard it shattered against her plate. My son-in-law David made a choking sound and reached for his napkin. Even my golden retriever, Honey, seemed to sense the tension and retreated to her bed in the corner. But Marcus just sat there, cutting his meat with surgical precision, as if he had asked about the weather or tomorrow's grocery list. I am Eleanor Whitmore, though most people in Millfield, Connecticut, know me as the woman who spent 47 years teaching third grade at Riverside Elementary. I am also the widow of Henry Whitmore, who left me well provided for when he passed 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack. Henry had been a successful insurance broker, meticulous about planning and investments, and our modest colonial home on Maple Street sat on property that had appreciated considerably over the decades. What people didn't know was that Henry had also been remarkably wise about real estate investments throughout our marriage, quietly building a portfolio that left me more financially secure than most widows my age. Marcus had been living with me for the past 18 months, ever since he graduated from college with a degree in business that seemed to have taught him everything about money and nothing about decency. His parents, my daughter Sarah and her husband David, had been thrilled when I offered to let him stay in my guest room while he figured out his next steps. They thought it would be good for both of us, companionship for me, free housing for him while he job searched. What none of us anticipated was how quickly Marcus would begin treating my home like his personal hotel and my bank account like his private fund. The transformation had been gradual, so subtle that I initially dismissed my growing unease as the natural adjustment period of multi-generational living. Marcus had always been charming, the kind of child who could talk his way out of trouble with teachers and talk his way into extra privileges with relatives. As a little boy, he would climb onto my lap and tell me I was his favorite person in the whole world, that when he grew up he wanted to live with me forever. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else's life now. During his first month in my house, Marcus had been the perfect house guest. He helped with groceries, offered to mow the lawn, and spent evenings watching old movies with me while sharing stories about his college experience. He had majored in finance, he told me proudly, because he wanted to help people manage their money better. He spoke about maybe working for a nonprofit someday, helping elderly people avoid financial scams. I remember feeling such pride, thinking about how Henry would have loved to see his grandson grow into such a thoughtful young man. But somewhere around month 2, things began to shift. Marcus started making comments about how large the house was for just one person, how much I must be spending on utilities and maintenance. He would shake his head sympathetically when I mentioned my monthly expenses, saying things like, "Grandma, you're being taken advantage of. That landscaping company is charging you way too much. You know, if I were handling your finances, I could probably save you thousands every year." At first I appreciated his concern. After Henry died, I had indeed felt overwhelmed by the financial responsibilities that my husband had always managed. Marcus seemed knowledgeable about investments and budgeting, and I began asking his opinion on various financial decisions. He was always ready with advice, usually suggesting that I should consolidate my accounts, simplify my investments, maybe consider giving family members early access to their inheritance for tax purposes. By month 6, Marcus had somehow positioned himself as my unofficial financial advisor. He had convinced me to add his name to one of my smaller checking accounts, ostensibly so he could help me manage day-to-day expenses and online banking. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, just until I felt more comfortable navigating the digital banking systems that Henry had always handled. Marcus assured me that this was completely normal, that most elderly people had trusted family members help with these kinds of tasks. What I didn't realize at the time was that Marcus was conducting a comprehensive audit of my financial situation. He spent hours on my computer, ostensibly helping me organize my digital files, but actually mapping out every investment account, every property holding, every asset that would eventually comprise my estate. He had convinced me to show him where Henry kept all our important documents, claiming he wanted to help me create a better organizational system in case of emergencies. The first red flag should have been when Marcus started suggesting that I needed to think seriously about estate planning. He would bring up news stories about elderly people whose assets got tied up in probate for years, causing tremendous hardship for their families. He painted vivid pictures of Sarah and David, struggling financially while lawyers and courts decided what to do with my money. Wouldn't it be better, he suggested, to start transferring assets now, while I was still healthy and sharp enough to make these decisions myself? Marcus had a way of making these conversations feel like expressions of love and concern. He would take my hands in his and tell me how much he worried about my future, how he wanted to make sure I was protected from people who might try to take advantage of me. The irony of those words would become crystal clear later, but at the time, they made me feel cared for and understood. By month 12, Marcus had successfully convinced me to make him the beneficiary on my largest investment account, a portfolio worth nearly $400,000 that Henry had built over decades of careful investing. Marcus presented this as a smart tax strategy, explaining that beneficiary designations avoided probate and ensured that the money would be available immediately if something happened to me. He had even printed out articles from financial websites that seemed to support his recommendation. But the moment that should have awakened me to the reality of what was happening occurred on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October. I had been feeling unwell, just a minor cold that had left me tired and congested. Marcus came home from one of his mysterious job interviews that never seemed to result in actual employment, and found me napping on the living room couch. Instead of checking if I needed anything or offering to make me tea, he stood in the doorway and said, "You know, Grandma, you really should consider moving to one of those senior communities. This house is getting to be too much for you." I opened my eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in months. Marcus was standing there in clothes I had paid for, holding car keys to a vehicle I was making the payments on, suggesting that I should leave the home where I had lived for 38 years. His expression wasn't one of concern or love, it was calculating, measuring, like someone appraising property. That night, I called my neighbor Margaret, who had been my closest friend since we both moved to Maple Street as young wives. Margaret was 81, sharp as a tack, and had no patience for what she called family nonsense. When I told her about Marcus's suggestion, she was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Eleanor, honey, that boy isn't worried about you. He's worried about getting his hands on that house." Margaret's words haunted me for weeks. I began paying closer attention to Marcus's behavior, and what I saw disturbed me deeply. He had developed a routine of going through my mail before I saw it, claiming he was helping me sort important documents from junk mail. He had convinced me to give him power of attorney for healthcare decisions, arguing that someone needed to be able to make medical choices for me if I ever became incapacitated. Most troubling of all, he had started treating my home like his own, inviting friends over without asking, using my credit cards for his personal expenses, and making it clear that he considered himself the man of the house. The final straw came in month 15, when I discovered that Marcus had been forging my signature on checks. I found out purely by accident, when my bank called to verify an unusually large withdrawal. When I asked Marcus about it, he didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. Instead, he launched into a lecture about how elderly people often forgot about their financial transactions, and how lucky I was to have someone looking out for my interests. That night, I sat in my bedroom and made a decision that would change everything. I was going to take back control of my life, my finances, and my home, but I was also going to be smart about it. Marcus had underestimated me, assuming that age had made me weak and gullible. He was about to learn that 47 years of managing classroom full of clever 8-year-olds had taught me a thing or two about dealing with manipulative behavior. The next morning, I called my attorney, James Richardson. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Who had handled Henry's estate and had been our family lawyer for over 20 years. James was in his 60s, methodical and thorough, with a reputation for protecting his elderly clients from exactly the kind of financial abuse I was beginning to understand. I had been experienced. When I walked into James's office that Tuesday morning, I thought I was going to discuss removing Marcus from my accounts and maybe getting some advice about how to handle the situation with minimal family drama. I had no idea that I was about to uncover a web of deception that went far deeper than stolen checks and unauthorized withdrawals. James listened to my story with the kind of focused attention that made me remember why Henry had trusted him for so many years. When I finished explaining about the forged signatures and the pressure to transfer assets, James was quiet for a moment before asking, "Eleanor, have you checked your credit report recently?" Marcus had told me that he was monitoring my credit for me, watching out for signs of identity theft that targeted elderly people. Another red flag that I had missed completely. James pulled up my credit report on his computer, and what we found made my stomach drop to the floor. Marcus had opened 3 credit cards in my name, taken out a home equity loan against my property, and had even applied for a personal loan using my social security number. The total debt he had accumulated in my name was over $80,000, but the most shocking discovery was yet to come. James found paperwork indicating that Marcus had filed a petition with the county to have me declared mentally incompetent, with himself named as my guardian. The petition claimed that I was suffering from dementia, that I was unable to manage my financial affairs, and that I needed someone to make decisions on my behalf. He had even included medical documentation that I had never seen before, supposedly from doctors I had never visited. The timeline suddenly made perfect sense. Marcus's increasing urgency about estate planning, his suggestions that I was becoming forgetful and confused, his insistence on handling more and more of my daily affairs. He wasn't just stealing from me in the present. He was setting up a legal framework that would give him complete control over my assets for the rest of my life. James explained that if the guardianship petition was approved, Marcus would have the legal authority to sell my home, liquidate my investments, and make all financial decisions without my consent. Worse yet, as my guardian, he could decide where I lived, what medical care I received, and who I was allowed to see. It would be nearly impossible for me to challenge his decisions once the court granted him this authority. The petition was scheduled for a hearing in just 6 weeks. Marcus had been confident that I would never find out about it, assuming that I was too trusting and too isolated to discover what he was doing. He had calculated that by the time anyone realized what was happening, it would be too late to stop him. But Marcus had made one crucial miscalculation. He had assumed that I was exactly what I appeared to be, a lonely, naive widow, who could be easily manipulated and controlled. What he didn't know was that spending nearly 5 decades in public education had taught me how to recognize predatory behavior, how to document evidence methodically, and how to outmaneuver people who thought they were smarter than everyone else in the room. James and I spent the rest of that morning developing what he called a defensive strategy. The first step was to secure my finances immediately. We arranged to freeze all of my existing accounts and open new ones at a different bank, with new account numbers that Marcus couldn't access. James also helped me file a police report about the identity theft and fraud, creating an official record of Marcus's criminal behavior. But the more complex challenge was dealing with the guardianship petition. Simply opposing it in court might not be enough, especially if Marcus had manufactured convincing medical evidence of my supposed mental decline. James suggested that we needed to be proactive, to gather our own evidence that would not only prove my competency but also expose Marcus's true motive. Over the next 2 weeks, I underwent comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations with doctors that James recommended. The results confirmed what I already knew, that I was mentally sharp, physically healthy for my age, and perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. But James warned me that we needed more than just medical reports. We needed to demonstrate a pattern of manipulation and abuse that would convince a judge that Marcus was the real threat to my well-being. That's when I made a decision that surprised even James. Instead of confronting Marcus immediately or throwing him out of my house, I was going to let him continue living with me while I gathered evidence of his criminal behavior. It was risky, but it was also the best way to document his ongoing fraud and build an ironclad case against him. For the next month, I became a detective in my own home. I installed a small recording device in the living room, hidden inside an old radio that Marcus never paid attention to. I started keeping detailed notes about every conversation we had about money, every suggestion he made about my health or competency, every action he took that demonstrated his assumption that he was already in control of my life. The recordings I captured during that month were more damning than I could have imagined. Marcus talked on the phone with friends about his plans to sell my house as soon as he gained guardianship, joking about how easy it had been to convince the old lady to trust him. He bragged about the life insurance policies he planned to take out on me once he had legal authority, and he discussed his timeline for moving me into a nursing home so he could have complete access to my assets. But the most chilling recording came 3 weeks before the guardianship hearing. Marcus was talking to someone on the phone, someone he called Babe, discussing their plans to get married as soon as his inheritance was secured. He described me as a temporary obstacle, and talked about how much faster everything would move once I was out of the picture. The casual cruelty in his voice as he discussed my death like a minor inconvenience was something I will never forget. It was during this period of covert evidence gathering that Marcus made the comment that would become the title of this story. We were having Sunday dinner, a tradition I had maintained even as our relationship deteriorated, when Marcus looked up from his plate and asked with completely casual brutality, "Grandma Eleanor, when do you think you'll die? I'm just wondering about the timeline for my inheritance." The question was so shocking, so completely devoid of human decency, that for a moment I couldn't even process what I was hearing. This was the same little boy who used to beg me to read him bedtime stories, who would cry if he thought he had hurt my feelings, who once made me a Mother's Day card that said, "You're the best grandma in the universe." Now he was sitting at my dinner table, eating food I had prepared, asking me to predict my own death so he could plan his financial future. But even as my heart was breaking, a part of my mind was calculating. Marcus had just given me the perfect piece of evidence to demonstrate his complete lack of care for my well-being. The recording device in the radio had captured every word, and his casual tone would make it clear to any judge that this wasn't a moment of anger or frustration. It was a young man who had become so comfortable with his planned exploitation that he no longer bothered to hide it. That night after Marcus went to bed, I sat in my kitchen and called James. When I told him about the dinner conversation, he was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Eleanor, I think it's time to go on the offensive. We have enough evidence to bury him, and waiting any longer just gives him more time to cause damage." James was right. The guardianship hearing was only 2 weeks away, and Marcus was growing increasingly impatient with the timeline. He had started making more aggressive suggestions about my need for professional care, and he had begun clearing out spare rooms in my house, claiming he was helping me declutter but actually making space for his girlfriend to move in. The next morning I made the phone call that would change everything. Instead of waiting for Marcus to try to take control of my life through the courts, I was going to beat him to the courthouse with my own petition. But I wasn't seeking guardianship over Marcus. I was seeking something far more devastating to his plans. I was going to have him legally removed from my property, from my accounts, and from any claim to my inheritance. And thanks to the evidence I had gathered, I was also going to have him arrested for elder abuse, identity theft, and fraud. The transformation from victim to victor was about to begin, and Marcus had no idea what was coming for him. The morning I decided to turn the tables on Marcus, I woke up feeling different. For months I had been living in a fog of confusion and hurt, trying to reconcile the loving grandson I remembered with the calculating stranger who had taken over my home. But clarity had finally cut through that fog like sunlight after a storm. I knew exactly what Marcus was, exactly what he was trying to do, and exactly how I was going to stop him. I made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table where Henry and I had shared breakfast for 38 years, looking out at the garden we had planted together. The October morning was crisp, with that particular golden light that makes everything look sharper, more defined. It felt appropriate. Today was the day I would begin taking back my life. Marcus was still asleep upstairs, probably exhausted from another late night on the phone with his girlfriend. making plans for the life they intended to build with my money. I had learned her name from listening to his conversations. Crystal, a 25-year-old aspiring influencer who seemed to share Marcus's belief that elderly relatives existed primarily as sources of funding for young people's dreams. While Marcus slept, I systematically began executing the plan that James and I had developed. The first step was securing my digital footprint. Marcus had convinced me to give him access to all of my online accounts, claiming it was for my own protection. Now I was going to use that access against him. I logged into my bank's website and began downloading every statement, every transaction record, every piece of documentation that showed Marcus's unauthorized use of my accounts. The evidence was overwhelming. In just 18 months, he had siphoned off nearly $30,000 through a combination of direct transfers, cash withdrawals and purchases that had nothing to do with household expenses or my care. The credit card statements were even more damning. Marcus had been living like a wealthy young bachelor on my credit, buying expensive clothes, electronics, and restaurant meals. He had even used my credit card to purchase an engagement ring for Crystal, a detail that made my stomach turn. He was literally using my money to finance his proposal to the woman he planned to marry after he gained control of my estate. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of emails I found in an account Marcus had created using my name. He had been corresponding with several assisted living facilities, requesting information about their most restrictive memory care units. The emails presented me as a confused, wandering elderly woman who posed a danger to herself and needed to be contained for my own safety. In one particularly chilling exchange, Marcus had asked about facilities that would accept residents who were declared mentally incompetent by the courts, and whether family members could visit such residents without supervision. The facility's response outlined their policies for residents who were under guardianship, explaining that the guardian had complete control over visitation rights, and could restrict or eliminate family contact if deemed necessary for the residents' well-being. Marcus had been planning not just to steal my money but to make me disappear. Once he gained guardianship, he could have me locked away in a memory care unit where I would have no contact with the outside world, no way to seek help, and no ability to challenge his control over my assets. I would become a living ghost, existing only to provide him with a steady stream of income until I died. The realization of how close I had come to this fate made my hands shake as I printed out the evidence. If I hadn't found out about the guardianship petition by accident, if James hadn't helped me understand what was happening, I would have walked into that courthouse in 2 weeks completely unprepared for what Marcus was trying to do to me. By the time Marcus woke up and stumbled downstairs looking for breakfast, I had assembled a comprehensive dossier of his criminal activity, but I didn't let my newfound knowledge show. Instead, I smiled and offered to make him pancakes, playing the role of the doting grandmother while I continued gathering evidence. Marcus accepted my offer with the casual entitlement that had become his standard behavior. He sat at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone while I cooked, occasionally making comments about how tired I looked, or how I seemed to be moving more slowly than usual. Each comment was carefully calculated to support his narrative of my declining mental state. While the pancakes were cooking, I listened to him take a phone call from someone he addressed as Dr. Morrison. The conversation was brief, but I caught enough to understand that this was the doctor who had supposedly diagnosed me with dementia for the guardianship petition. Marcus was confirming an appointment for the following week, thanking the doctor for being flexible with the documentation, and discussing payment for services that I had never received. The casual corruption in that phone call was breathtaking. Marcus had found a doctor willing to falsify medical records for money, creating a paper trail of cognitive decline that existed only in fraudulent documents. This wasn't just elder abuse, it was a criminal conspiracy involving multiple people who were willing to destroy an innocent person's life for financial gain. After Marcus finished his breakfast and left the house for another one of his mysterious appointments, I called James and shared what I had discovered. His reaction was immediate and decisive. James explained that we now had enough evidence to file criminal charges that could result in serious prison time for Marcus. Identity theft, elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy were all felonies that carried significant penalties. But more importantly for my immediate situation, we could use this evidence to not only defeat the guardianship petition, but to turn it into a weapon against Marcus. James had been researching the doctor that Marcus had bribed, and what he found was even more disturbing than I had expected. Doc Morrison had a history of ethical violations and had been investigated twice by the state medical board for falsifying records. He specialized in providing fraudulent documentation for people seeking to gain control over elderly relatives' assets, and Marcus was apparently just his latest client. But Dr. Morrison's history of corruption was actually going to work in our favor. James had contacts in the district attorney's office who had been trying to build a case against the doctor for months. Our evidence of his collaboration with Marcus could be the missing piece they needed to finally shut down his operation and prosecute everyone involved. The plan we developed was more comprehensive than anything I could have imagined. Instead of simply defending against Marcus's guardianship petition, we were going to launch a coordinated legal attack that would destroy his scheme completely and ensure that he faced serious consequences for what he had tried to do to me. James filed an emergency motion to dismiss the guardianship petition based on fraudulent medical evidence. He also filed a restraining order to prevent Marcus from accessing any of my accounts or making any decisions on my behalf. Most importantly, he petitioned the court to freeze all assets that Marcus had illegally transferred to himself, ensuring that he couldn't disappear with my money before he could be prosecuted. But the most satisfying element of our plan was the criminal complaint that James helped me file with the police. We provided them with recordings, financial records, email correspondence, and documentation of the fraudulent medical diagnosis. The detective who took my statement said it was one of the most thoroughly documented cases of elder abuse he had ever seen. While James was handling the legal aspects of our counterattack, I was working on the personal side of the equation. I had decided that Marcus needed to understand exactly who he had been trying to manipulate, and I wanted him to hear it from me directly before the police knocked on his door. That evening, I prepared what I knew would be our last dinner together. I made Marcus's favorite meal, meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans, and set the table with my best china. I wanted everything to be perfect for the conversation we were about to have. Marcus came home around 6 o'clock, in an unusually good mood. He had apparently had a productive meeting with someone, though he was vague about the details. He complimented me on the dinner, and even offered to help clean up afterward, a gesture that would have seemed generous if I hadn't known it was probably motivated by guilt over what he was planning to do to me. We ate in companionable silence for the first few minutes, with Marcus telling me about his day and asking about mine. The normalcy of the conversation was surreal, considering that in just a few hours, his entire world was going to come crashing down around him. When we finished eating, Marcus started to get up from the table, but I gently asked him to stay for a moment. I told him I had something important to discuss with him, something about our future together. The phrase made his eyes light up with what I now recognized as greed rather than affection. I began by telling Marcus how much his presence in my home had meant to me over the past 18 months. I thanked him for his help with my finances, his concern for my health, and his suggestions about my future care needs. I could see him relaxing, probably thinking I was about to tell him how grateful I was for his guidance and how much I trusted his judgment. Then I shifted the conversation in a direction he wasn't expecting. I told Marcus that I had been doing some research about elder care options, and I had discovered some concerning information about the facilities he had recommended. I mentioned that I had found it odd that these facilities specialized in caring for people with severe dementia, when I hadn't been diagnosed with any cognitive issue. Marcus's expression flickered, but he quickly recovered and launched into his standard explanation about the importance of planning ahead, about how cognitive decline could happen suddenly and how much better it would be if arrangements were already in place. His voice had the smooth, practiced tone of someone who had rehearsed this speech many times. I nodded along with his explanation, asking occasional questions that seemed to accept his premise, while actually drawing him deeper into revealing his true intention. I asked about the costs of these facilities, about whether insurance would cover them, about how long people typically stayed in memory care units. Marcus answered each question with disturbing specificity, clearly demonstrating that he had researched every aspect of how to have me institutionalized. He knew the admission requirements, the legal procedures, and the financial arrangements down to the smallest detail. His knowledge was so comprehensive that it was obvious he had been planning this for months, but the moment that revealed the true depth of his callousness came when I asked him what would happen to people in memory care who didn't actually have dementia. I posed the question as a hypothetical, wondering aloud whether someone with normal cognitive function would be miserable in such a restrictive environment. Marcus's answer chilled me to the bone. He said that people who were admitted to memory care units were there because their families had made the difficult decision that institutionalization was necessary for everyone's well-being. He explained that even if residents complained about their treatment or claimed they didn't belong there, the facility staff were trained to understand that such protests were often symptoms of the very conditions that made institutional care necessary. In other words, Marcus had figured out how to create a perfect trap. Once I was committed to a memory care facility under his guardianship, any attempts I made to explain that I wasn't actually suffering from dementia would be dismissed as evidence of my mental illness. I would be trapped in a system designed to ignore the very protests that proved I didn't belong there. The casual way Marcus explained this psychological torture made it clear that he had given considerable thought to how my imprisonment would be maintained. He wasn't just planning to steal my money, he was planning to destroy my sanity by convincing me that everyone I trusted believed I was losing my mind. But Marcus had made one crucial error in his calculation. He had assumed that I was already too confused and dependent to understand what he was telling me. He thought he was explaining these concepts to someone who lacked the mental capacity to recognize the threat they represent. When I thanked him for being so thorough in his research and told him how much I appreciated having someone I could trust to make such important decisions for me, Marcus visibly relaxed. He even reached across the table and patted my hand, telling me how much he loved me and how he would always make sure I was taken care of. The irony of that moment was almost overwhelming. Marcus was expressing his love for me in the same breath as describing his plans to have me locked away in a facility where I would be treated as mentally incompetent for the rest of my life. In his mind, these two things were completely compatible. That's when I decided it was time to drop the facade. I looked Marcus in the eye and said, very quietly, "Marcus, I need to tell you something. I know about the guardianship petition." The change in his expression was immediate and dramatic. The mask of loving concern disappeared instantly, replaced by something cold and calculating. For a moment he seemed to be weighing his options, trying to decide whether to continue the pretense or abandon it entirely. He chose to abandon. Marcus leaned back in his chair and smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had been caught but wasn't particularly concerned about the consequences. He told me that he was glad I knew, because he was tired of pretending to care about my opinions on decisions that would ultimately be made for me anyway. The transformation was so complete that it was like watching one person disappear and another take their place. The Marcus who had just been holding my hand and expressing his love was gone, replaced by a stranger who spoke to me with undisguised contempt. He told me that the guardianship petition was just a formality, that the outcome was already predetermined. He had medical documentation proving that I was mentally incompetent. He had financial records showing that I was unable to manage my own affairs, and he had testimonials from people who had witnessed my declining condition. Marcus explained that he had been building this case for over a year, carefully documenting every instance of forgetfulness, every moment of confusion, every sign that I was no longer capable of independent living. He had kept a detailed journal of my supposed symptoms, and he had recordings of conversations where I had seemed disoriented or uncertain. The sick brilliance of his plan was becoming clear. Marcus hadn't just been stealing from me, he had been systematically creating evidence of my mental decline. Every time I had asked him to repeat something or had trouble understanding a new technology, he had recorded it as evidence of dementia. Every time I had relied on his help with financial matters, he had documented it as proof that I was incapable of managing my own affairs. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. Marcus told me that even if I tried to fight the guardianship petition, it wouldn't matter. He had already convinced my daughter Sarah that I was showing signs of cognitive decline, and she was prepared to testify in support of the petition if necessary. The betrayal of learning that my own daughter had been turned against me was almost more than I could bear. Marcus saw the pain in my eyes and seemed to take satisfaction in it. He told me that Sarah was genuinely concerned about my welfare, that she believed the guardianship was in my best interests, and that she was grateful to Marcus for taking on such a difficult responsibility. Marcus had played the role of the caring grandson so convincingly that he had fooled not just me, but my entire family. Sarah thought he was sacrificing his own future to take care of me, and she admired him for his dedication. She had no idea that he was actually destroying my future to benefit his own. The manipulation was so sophisticated that I found myself almost admiring its complexity, even as I was horrified by its cruelty. Marcus had identified every relationship that mattered to me, and had systematically corrupted each one. He had turned my trust into dependence, my love into vulnerability, and my family into unwitting accomplices. But Marcus had made one critical mistake in his moment of triumph. He had assumed that revealing his plan would defeat me, that learning about the depth of his betrayal would leave me too broken to fight back. He thought that an elderly woman who had been isolated and manipulated for over a year would simply accept her fate and submit to his control. Marcus had no idea that he was talking to someone who had spent nearly 50 years dealing with manipulative behavior in its most creative forms. Elementary school teachers learned to recognize every variety of deception, manipulation, and psychological warfare that the human mind can devise. I had seen it all before, just in smaller packages. More importantly, Marcus didn't know that while he had been building his case against me, I had been building a case against him. While he thought he was documenting my decline, I had been documenting his crime. While he was manipulating my family, I was gathering evidence that would expose his manipulation. I looked at Marcus and smiled. It was the same kind of smile he had given me, cold, calculating, and completely without warmth. Then I said, "Marcus, I need to tell you something else. Tomorrow morning, you're going to be arrested." The confidence drained from his face like water from a broken glass. He started to say something, probably another lie or manipulation, but I held up my hand to stop him. I told Marcus that I had been recording our conversations for weeks, that I had documented every fraudulent transaction he had made in my name, and that I had already filed criminal charges against him with the police. I explained that his fake medical records had been exposed, that his conspirator Dr. Morrison was already under investigation, and that the guardianship petition had been dismissed based on fraudulent evidence. But the piece of information that seemed to hit him hardest was when I told him that I had frozen all of the accounts he had been accessing, and that every penny he had stolen would be recovered. The engagement ring he had bought for Crystal, the car payments I had been making for him, the credit card debt he had accumulated in my name, all of it would be reversed, and he would be held financially responsible for every fraudulent transaction. Marcus sat in stunned silence for several minutes, clearly trying to process how completely his plan had collapsed. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and uncertain, nothing like the confident manipulator who had been gloating just moments before. He asked me how I had found out about the guardianship petition, how I had gathered evidence without him knowing, and how I had managed to build a legal case while appearing to be completely under his control. There was genuine confusion in his voice, as if he couldn't understand how someone he considered mentally deficient had outmaneuvered him so completely. I told Marcus that he had made the same mistake that many manipulative people make. He had confused kindness with weakness, trust with stupidity, and age with incompetence. He had been so convinced of his own superiority that he had never considered the possibility that his victim might be smarter than he was. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Marcus went through what seemed like every stage of grief in the span of an hour. He started with denial, insisting that I was confused and that the guardianship petition was for my own good. When that didn't work, he moved to anger, accusing me of being ungrateful and selfish for not appreciating everything he had done for me. The bargaining phase was particularly pathetic. Marcus offered to forget about the guardianship petition if I would agree to give him a smaller portion of my estate immediately. He suggested that we could work out a compromise that would benefit both of us, and he promised that he would take better care of me if I would just give him another chance. When bargaining failed, Marcus collapsed into what appeared to be genuine despair. He put his head in his hands and sobbed, telling me that he was sorry that he had never meant for things to go so far, and that he had just gotten in over his head with debts and commitments to Crystal. But even his tears felt calculated to me. After 18 months of systematic manipulation and psychological abuse, I found it impossible to believe that Marcus was capable of genuine remorse. His sorrow seemed less about the pain he had caused me, and more about the consequences he was going to face for his action. The final stage, acceptance, came when Marcus realized that nothing he said was going to change what was about to happen to him. The police would arrest him in the morning, he would be charged with multiple felonies, and his dreams of inheriting my estate would be permanently destroyed. In that moment of acceptance, the real Marcus emerged one last time. He looked at me with pure hatred and said that he hoped I would die alone and forgotten, that I deserved whatever happened to me for being stupid enough to trust him in the first place. He told me that he had never loved me, that spending time with me had been torture, and that he couldn't wait to be free of the burden of pretending to care about my well-being. Those words should have hurt me, but they actually provided a strange kind of relief. The loving grandson I had been mourning had never actually existed. The child who had sat on my lap and told me I was his favorite person in the world had been practicing manipulation even then. I wasn't losing someone I loved. I was finally seeing someone I had never really known. That night, Marcus packed his belongings and left my house without another word. I didn't try to stop him or ask where he was going. I simply watched from my bedroom window as he loaded his car with the possessions he had accumulated during his 18 months of deception. As I watched him drive away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: complete peace. My home was mine again, my finances were secure, and my future was back under my own control. Marcus was gone, and he would never be able to hurt me or anyone else in my family again. The next morning, just as I had promised, the police arrived at Marcus's new address and arrested him on charges of elder abuse, identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy. The local news covered his arrest, describing him as part of a larger investigation into a network of people who targeted elderly victims for financial exploitation. But my victory over Marcus was just the beginning of a larger battle. I still had to repair the relationships he had damaged, rebuild the trust he had destroyed, and help my family understand how completely they had been deceived by someone they thought they knew and loved. The morning after Marcus's arrest, my house felt different in ways I hadn't expected. The silence wasn't the heavy, oppressive quiet that had settled over my home during the months of his manipulation. Instead, it was the peaceful silence of safety, of control restored, of a life reclaimed. I made my coffee in the kitchen where Marcus had asked me when I planned to die, and for the first time in 18 months, I felt genuinely hungry for breakfast. The local newspaper had picked up the story of Marcus's arrest, though they had been careful to protect my identity. The headline read, "Local man arrested in elder abuse scheme," and the article described a pattern of financial exploitation that investigators believed had targeted multiple elderly victims. Reading about Marcus's crimes in black and white made them feel more real somehow, as if seeing them in print validated the nightmare I had been living. My phone had been ringing since 7 in the morning. News of Marcus's arrest had spread quickly through our small community, and neighbors, friends, and family members were calling to express their shock and offer their support. But the call I was dreading most came just after 9 o'clock, when my daughter Sarah's name appeared on my phone screen. Sarah's voice was shaking when I answered. She had seen the news report and recognized enough details to realize that Marcus was the grandson mentioned in the article. Her first words were an apology so heartfelt that it broke my heart all over again. She sobbed into the phone about how sorry she was, how she should have seen what was happening, how she had failed to protect me from someone she had trusted completely. But what hurt me most wasn't Sarah's apology, it was the realization of how thoroughly Marcus had manipulated her as well. Sarah told me that Marcus had been calling her regularly for months, expressing concern about my mental state, and suggesting that I needed more supervision than I was willing to accept. He had shared specific examples of my supposed confusion and forgetfulness, painting a picture of cognitive decline that had genuinely frightened my daughter. Marcus had been particularly clever in his manipulation of Sarah because he had appealed to her sense of responsibility and love for me. He never suggested that she wasn't doing enough to help me. Instead, he positioned himself as the solution to problems she didn't even know existed. He offered to take on the burden of my care so that Sarah could focus on her own family and career without feeling guilty about my welfare. The sophistication of his psychological manipulation was breathtaking. Marcus had identified each family member's vulnerabilities and had crafted specific approaches to exploit them. With Sarah, he had played on her fear of losing me to dementia and her guilt about not being able to provide hands-on care herself. With David, my son-in-law, he had emphasized the financial benefits of early estate planning and the importance of protecting family assets from potential healthcare costs. Sarah's call lasted over 2 hours, during which she shared details about Marcus's manipulation that I hadn't known about. He had been building his case against me with family members for over a year, sharing carefully selected anecdotes and observations that supported his narrative of my declining competence. He had even convinced Sarah to consider having me evaluated by a geriatric psychiatrist, claiming that early intervention could slow the progression of cognitive decline. The most disturbing revelation was that Marcus had been working to isolate me from my support network without anyone realizing it. He had told Sarah that large social gatherings were overwhelming for me, suggesting that family events should be smaller and quieter to accommodate my supposed sensitivity. He had convinced my friends that I was becoming embarrassed by my memory problems and preferred not to have visitors. Gradually, he had reduced my contact with the outside world while making it seem like he was protecting my dignity and comfort. But Sarah also shared information that helped me understand how Marcus's scheme had finally unraveled. She told me that she had started to have doubts about his version of events when she noticed inconsistencies in his stories about my behavior. Marcus had claimed that I was becoming increasingly confused about financial matters, but when Sarah had spoken to me directly about money, I had seemed perfectly lucid and informed. The turning point for Sarah had come 2 weeks earlier, when Marcus had called her to report that I had gotten lost driving to the grocery store and had been found by police several miles away, confused and disoriented. Sarah had been so worried that she had driven straight to my house to check on me, only to find me working in my garden with no memory of any incident involving the police. When Sarah had asked me about getting lost, I had been completely bewildered by the question. Not only had I not gotten lost, but I hadn't even driven anywhere that day. I had spent the entire afternoon at home, working on a quilt in my sewing room. The story Marcus had told was completely fabricated, but it was so specific and alarming that Sarah had believed it without question. That fabricated incident had been Marcus's mistake. Sarah had begun to wonder what other stories might have been exaggerated or invented, and she had started paying closer attention to the differences between Marcus's reports about my condition and her own observations of my behavior. The inconsistencies had been troubling enough that she had planned to discuss them with me during our next visit. Sarah's growing skepticism had accelerated Marcus's timeline for the guardianship petition. He had realized that his window of opportunity was closing, and he needed to establish legal control over my affairs before his manipulation was exposed. The urgency had made him careless, leading to the mistakes that had ultimately revealed his entire scheme. But the conversation with Sarah also revealed the depth of the damage that Marcus's manipulation had caused to our family relationships. Sarah had been carrying tremendous guilt about my supposed decline, blaming herself for not recognizing the signs earlier and not providing more support. She had been planning to have difficult conversations with me about my independence and safety. Conversations that would have been devastating for both of us, based on lies that Marcus had told. The ripple effects of Marcus's deception extended far beyond the immediate financial crime. He had poisoned the trust and communication between family members, creating doubt and suspicion where there had once been love and confidence. Even now that the truth was revealed, it would take time and effort to repair the relationships he had damaged. Sarah's call was followed by similar conversations with other family members and friends who had been touched by Marcus's manipulation. My neighbor Margaret called to apologize for not speaking up sooner about her concerns regarding Marcus's behavior. She had noticed that he seemed to be taking over more of my daily activities, but she had assumed it was a natural progression of family support rather than a calculated takeover. My pastor, Reverend Williams, called to share that Marcus had approached him several months earlier about the possibility of arranging additional support services for me through the church. Marcus had suggested that I was becoming too proud to ask for help directly, and he had requested that any assistance be coordinated through him to avoid embarrassing me. Reverend Williams had been impressed by Marcus's thoughtfulness and had agreed to the arrangement, never suspecting that it was another layer of isolation and control. Each phone call revealed another aspect of Marcus's comprehensive campaign to establish himself as my guardian and caretaker. He had been methodically building support for his narrative among everyone who mattered in my life, creating a consensus that I needed protection and oversight that only he could provide. But the call that surprised me most came from Crystal, Marcus's girlfriend. She had somehow gotten my phone number and had called to apologize for her role in what she now understood had been a criminal conspiracy. Her voice was shaky and she sounded very young as she tried to explain her relationship with Marcus and what she had known about his plan. Crystal told me that Marcus had initially presented his living situation with me as a temporary arrangement while he saved money for their future together. He had described me as a wealthy widow who appreciated having family nearby for company and security. He had never mentioned guardianship or care facilities, and he had certainly never suggested that he was stealing from me or planning to have me institutionalized. According to Crystal, Marcus had told her that I was gradually transferring assets to him as part of a planned inheritance, and that the transfers were my idea rather than his suggestion. He had explained the expensive gifts and lifestyle improvements as evidence of my generosity toward a beloved grandson who was helping me manage my affairs. But Crystal had started to have questions when Marcus began talking about wedding plans that seemed far beyond what his actual income could support. When she had asked about the source of his sudden wealth, Marcus had told her that I had made him a major beneficiary in my will and had given him early access to some of his inheritance for tax planning purposes. The story had seemed plausible to Crystal because she knew that wealthy elderly people often did make significant gifts to family members for estate planning reasons. She had assumed that Marcus was simply the beneficiary of his grandmother's financial planning rather than the perpetrator of financial abuse. But Crystal's doubts had intensified when Marcus had started talking about my supposed need for assisted living care. He had told her that I was developing dementia and that he was going to have to make difficult decisions about my care in the near future. When Crystal had suggested that she would like to meet me and perhaps help with my care, Marcus had firmly discouraged the idea, claiming that I was becoming suspicious of new people and that visitors upset me. The conversation with Crystal was painful in a different way than the calls from family members. She was clearly a victim of Marcus's manipulation as well, but her victimization had been focused on creating a relationship based on lies rather than stealing money or planning institutionalization. She had genuinely believed that she was falling in love with a caring, responsible young man who was sacrificing his own interests to take care of his elderly grandmother. Crystal told me that when she learned about Marcus's arrest, her first emotion had been disbelief. The man she thought she knew seemed incapable of the cruelty and calculating manipulation described in the criminal charges. But as she reflected on their relationship, she began to recognize patterns of deception and control that she had previously attributed to his concern for her well-being. Marcus had isolated Crystal from her friends and family just as he had isolated me, though more subtly and over a shorter time period. He had convinced her that her friends were jealous of their relationship and that her family didn't understand their love. He had gradually taken over more of her decision-making, claiming that he was protecting her from people who wanted to take advantage of her naivety. Crystal's experience with Marcus helped me understand that his manipulation of me wasn't personal, it was simply how he related to people. He saw relationships as opportunities for control and exploitation, and he was skilled at identifying and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities in anyone who trusted him. But Crystal also provided information that helped explain Marcus's urgency about the guardianship petition. She told me that Marcus had significant gambling debts that he had hidden from everyone, including her. He owed money to dangerous people who had been pressuring him for payment, and he had promised them that he would have access to substantial funds by the end of the year. The gambling addiction explained several aspects of Marcus's behavior that had puzzled me. His mysterious appointments were often trips to casinos or meetings with bookmakers. His expensive lifestyle wasn't just financed by my stolen money, it was also funded by borrowed money that he couldn't afford to repay. The guardianship scheme wasn't just about greed, it was about survival. Crystal's revelation about the gambling debts made me realize how much danger I had actually been. Marcus wasn't just planning to steal my money gradually over time, he was planning to liquidate my assets as quickly as possible to pay off debts to people who might have threatened violence if he didn't pay them. The memory care facility wasn't just about keeping me quiet, it was about removing me from the picture entirely so that he could access my assets without interference. The phone calls continued throughout the morning, each one revealing another layer of Marcus's deception and manipulation. By afternoon, I had a comprehensive understanding of how extensive his scheme had been, and how many people had been affected by his lies. The web of manipulation was so complex that it would take months to fully untangle all of the relationships and arrangements he had corrupted. But the most important call came from James, my attorney, who had spent the morning coordinating with law enforcement and reviewing the criminal charges against Marcus. James told me that the district attorney was treating Marcus's case as part of a larger investigation into elder abuse networks, and that several other people, including Dr. Morrison, were also facing criminal charges. The investigation had revealed that Marcus was part of a more extensive conspiracy than we had initially realized. Dr. Morrison had been providing fraudulent medical documentation for multiple families where younger relatives were seeking guardianship over elderly family members. The scheme involved lawyers, social workers, and care facility administrators, who were all profiting from the systematic exploitation of elderly people. Marcus's arrest had provided investigators with evidence that was helping them build cases against the entire network. The recordings I had made of his conversations were particularly valuable because they documented not just his individual crimes, but also his references to other people involved in similar schemes. James explained that Marcus was facing a minimum of 15 years in prison if convicted on all charges, and that the evidence against him was so overwhelming that his attorney was already discussing plea bargain options. The criminal case was proceeding quickly because Marcus's crimes were well documented, and because his cooperation with the investigation could help prosecutors build cases against other members of the network. But James also had news about the civil aspects of my case. All of the money that Marcus had stolen from me would be recovered, plus interest and penalties. The fraudulent debts he had created in my name would be eliminated, and my credit report would be restored to its previous status. Most importantly, the guardianship petition had been permanently dismissed, and Marcus would never be able to file another petition seeking control over my affairs. The legal resolution of my case was more comprehensive than I had dared to hope. Not only would I recover everything that Marcus had stolen, but I would also be protected from any future attempts at exploitation. The court had placed permanent restrictions on Marcus's ability to contact me or interfere with my financial affairs, and any violation of those restrictions would result in additional criminal charges. But the emotional and psychological recovery would take longer than the legal and financial resolution. Living with someone who was systematically planning your destruction while pretending to love and care for you leaves scars that don't heal quickly. I found myself questioning my judgment about people and relationships in ways that I never had before. The most difficult aspect of recovery was rebuilding trust in my own perceptions and decisions. Marcus had been so skilled at making me doubt my own memories and observations that I had started to question my ability to understand what was happening around me. Even though I knew intellectually that I had been deliberately manipulated, the emotional impact of that manipulation continued to affect my confidence in my own judgment. James referred me to a therapist who specialized in helping victims of psychological abuse, and I began weekly sessions focused on understanding and recovering from the trauma of Marcus's manipulation. The therapy helped me recognize that what had happened to me wasn't a result of weakness or gullibility. It was the result of sophisticated psychological manipulation by someone who had studied my vulnerabilities and exploited them systematically. But the therapy also helped me understand my own strength and resilience. I had not only survived Marcus's abuse, but I had recognized it, gathered evidence against it, and ultimately defeated it completely. The same intelligence and determination that had made me an effective teacher for nearly 50 years had also made me capable of protecting myself when my safety was threatened. The community response to news of Marcus's arrest was overwhelming in its support. Neighbors who had barely spoken to me in years stopped by to check on my well-being and offer assistance. Members of my church organized meals and visits to ensure that I wouldn't feel isolated or abandoned in the aftermath of Marcus's betrayal. But the most meaningful support came from other elderly people who had experienced similar attempts at exploitation by family members. Margaret introduced me to a support group for victims of elder abuse, where I met other people who had survived everything from financial manipulation to psychological intimidation by people they had trusted. The support group helped me understand that Marcus's behavior wasn't unique or unusual. Elder abuse by family members was far more common than most people realized, and the tactics Marcus had used were remarkably similar to those employed by other manipulative relatives. The group provided both emotional support and practical advice about protecting myself from future exploitation. One of the most valuable aspects of the support group was learning about warning signs that I could watch for in future relationships. The members taught me to recognize the subtle ways that manipulative people tested boundaries and established control, and they helped me develop strategies for maintaining my independence, while still accepting appropriate help from family and friends. My experience with Marcus had taught me that trust should be earned gradually rather than given freely, and that love and care should be demonstrated through actions rather than words. The support group reinforced these lessons and helped me understand that protecting myself from exploitation wasn't selfish or paranoid. It was a necessary part of maintaining my autonomy and dignity. The trial preparation process took several months, during which I had to provide testimony about Marcus's crimes and their impact on my life. The process was emotionally draining, but it was also empowering to have my experience validated by the legal system and to know that my testimony would help ensure that Marcus faced appropriate consequences for his actions. Marcus ultimately accepted a plea bargain that resulted in a sentence of 12 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. As part of the plea agreement, he was required to pay full restitution for all of the money he had stolen, plus additional penalties and court costs. He was also permanently barred from serving as a guardian or caretaker for any elderly person. The sentencing hearing was the last time I saw Marcus in person. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his crimes and the consequences he was facing. When given the opportunity to make a statement to the court, he offered what seemed like a genuine apology for the pain he had caused me and other family members, but even his apology felt calculated to me. Marcus had always been skilled at saying whatever he thought people wanted to hear, and I suspected that his expression of remorse was motivated more by a desire for leniency than by genuine regret for his action. The damage he had caused was too extensive and too deliberate to be explained by simple mistakes or momentary lapses in judgment. The judge's comments during sentencing made it clear that Marcus's crimes were particularly serious, because they involved the betrayal of family trust and the systematic abuse of an elderly person who had shown him nothing but love and generosity. The judge noted that elderly victims of family abuse often suffered more severe psychological trauma than victims of stranger crimes, because the betrayal of trust was so complete and devastating. After the sentencing, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The legal process had validated my experience and had held Marcus accountable for his actions in a way that felt proportionate to the harm he had caused. Justice had been served, and I could finally begin to move forward with my life without looking over my shoulder for threats from someone I had trusted completely. The year following Marcus's sentencing was a period of rebuilding and rediscovery. I had to relearn how to make decisions without second-guessing myself, how to trust my own perceptions, and how to form relationships without the fear of being manipulated or exploited. I returned to volunteering at the elementary school where I had taught, working with children who were struggling with reading comprehension. The work reminded me of my strengths and abilities, and it provided a sense of purpose and accomplishment that helped rebuild my confidence in my own judgment and capability. I also became involved in advocacy work focused on preventing elder abuse and educating elderly people about the warning signs of financial exploitation by family members. Speaking publicly about my experience was initially difficult, but it became easier as I realized how much my story could help other people recognize and respond to similar threats. The advocacy work connected me with other survivors of elder abuse, and together we developed educational programs for senior centers, churches, and community organizations. We taught elderly people about their rights, about warning signs of exploitation, and about resources available to help them protect themselves from abuse. One of the most rewarding aspects of the advocacy work was hearing from people who had recognized manipulation in their own families and had taken steps to protect themselves before serious harm was done. Our educational programs helped elderly people understand that they had the right to maintain control over their own finances and decisions, and that accepting help from family members didn't require surrendering their autonomy. But the work also made me aware of how many elderly people were suffering in silence from abuse by family members they loved and trusted. The shame and embarrassment of being victimized by someone they cared about often prevented elderly people from seeking help, and many suffered for years before finding the courage to report the abuse. 2 years after Marcus's sentencing, Sarah and I had rebuilt our relationship stronger than it had been before his manipulation. The experience had taught us both the importance of direct communication and honest conversation about difficult topics. We had learned not to rely on third parties to interpret each other's thoughts and feelings, and we had developed new patterns of interaction that were more resistant to outside manipulation. Sarah had also become involved in the advocacy work, using her experience as a family member who had been deceived by an abuser to help other families recognize and respond to warning signs of elder abuse. Her perspective was valuable because she could speak to other adult children about the subtle ways that manipulative relatives could exploit family dynamics and turn family members against each other. David had taken responsibility for helping me establish new financial safeguards that would protect me from future exploitation while still allowing me to maintain my independence. We worked with James to create a system of checks and balances that would make it virtually impossible for anyone to gain unauthorized access to my accounts or to manipulate my financial decisions. The safeguards included regular financial reviews with my attorney, automatic notifications for any large transactions or account changes, and a network of trusted advisors who were authorized to question any financial decisions that seemed unusual or potentially harmful. The system protected my autonomy while providing oversight that would detect and prevent future attempts at exploitation. 3 years after Marcus's arrest, I received a letter from him in prison. The letter was forwarded through James, who had reviewed it to ensure that it didn't contain any threats or attempts at further manipulation. Marcus wrote that he had undergone counseling for his gambling addiction and that he had come to understand the full extent of the harm he had caused me and other family members. The letter included what seemed like a sincere apology for his actions and an acknowledgement of the trust he had betrayed. Marcus wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, but that he wanted me to know that he was working to become a better person, and that he would never again exploit the trust of elderly people. I read the letter several times before deciding how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe that Marcus had genuinely changed, that the counseling and consequences had helped him understand the cruelty of his actions, but a larger part of me remembered how skilled he had always been at saying whatever he thought people wanted to hear. Ultimately, I decided not to respond to the letter. Marcus had forfeited the right to have a relationship with me when he had decided to systematically plan my destruction while pretending to love me. Whether or not he had genuinely changed was irrelevant to my decision to protect myself from any future contact with him. James helped me obtain a permanent restraining order that would prevent Marcus from contacting me after his release from prison. The order was particularly important because Marcus would be eligible for parole in 8 years, and I wanted to ensure that he would never again have the opportunity to insert himself into my life. But the most important outcome of my experience with Marcus was the understanding I gained about my own strength and resilience. I had survived sophisticated psychological manipulation by someone who had studied my vulnerabilities and exploited them systematically. I had recognized the threat, gathered evidence against it, and ultimately defeated it completely. The experience had taught me that age doesn't make people weak or vulnerable unless they allow it to. Intelligence, determination, and self-respect are not diminished by the passage of time, and elderly people have the same right to autonomy and dignity that they had when they were younger. My home on Maple Street became a sanctuary again, a place where I could live independently and make my own decisions without fear of manipulation or exploitation. The garden that Henry and I had planted together continued to bloom each spring, and I continued to tend it with the same care and attention that I had given it for nearly 4 decades. The elementary school where I had taught for nearly 50 years invited me to return as a volunteer mentor for new teachers, sharing my experience and wisdom with young educators who were just beginning their career. The work reminded me daily of the positive impact that one person can have on the lives of others when they choose to use their knowledge and experience to help rather than to harm. On quiet evenings, I would sit in my living room, where Marcus had once plotted my destruction, and I would feel grateful for the strength that had allowed me to survive his betrayal and rebuild my life. The house that he had tried to steal had become a symbol of my victory over his manipulation, a tangible reminder that love and trust, when properly protected, are stronger than greed and deception. 5 years after Marcus's arrest, I celebrated my 77th birthday surrounded by family and friends who had supported me through the darkest period of my life. Sarah and David brought their children, who had grown old enough to understand something of what their great-uncle had tried to do to me and why he was no longer part of our family. The celebration was held in my garden among the flowers that had witnessed Henry's love, Marcus's betrayal, and my ultimate triumph over both grief and deception. As I looked around at the faces of people who genuinely cared about my well-being, I felt a deep sense of peace and satisfaction. Marcus had asked me when I planned to die, viewing my death as the key to his financial future, but I had outlived his scheme, outlasted his manipulation, and outlasted his freedom. I had not only survived his attempt to destroy me, but I had used the experience to help other elderly people protect themselves from similar abuse. The question Marcus had asked me during that terrible Sunday dinner had been answered not with a date or timeline, but with a demonstration of the strength and resilience that he had so completely underestimated. I would die when my time came naturally, in my own home, surrounded by people who loved me for who I was, rather than what I could give them. Until that day came, I would continue to live with the independence and dignity that Marcus had tried to steal from me, secure in the knowledge that I had faced the worst kind of betrayal and had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to make my own choices about my own life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.